Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm sure you've had a long day, but the best punchline to a long day is talking about how we can be thinking about our own personal health and how we can embrace longevity. I'm Abby Miller-Levy. I am the managing partner and co-founder of a venture capital fund called Primetime Partners. We invest in businesses focused on aging and longevity. You might ask how someone in their mid-40s decided to launch a venture fund focused on aging and longevity. And for me personally, I will get to that, but let's hear from our amazing panelists first. Just a note, Joe Coughlin, who runs the MIT Aging Lab, was stuck in Los Angeles, and so he will not be joining us. But since I did speak to him a couple days ago, I will try to channel his wisdom and his presence in the conversation today. So I would love our panelists to introduce themselves, and if they can, to tell a little bit of their founding story about their organizations, and really what was the spark that got, in your case, Melanie to join, in your case, Celine, to start your business.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Melanie Goldey. I'm the CEO of a consumer biotech company called Tally Health that was founded to change the way we age. We've developed an epigenetic age test. It's a simple cheek swab that you can do at home that will reveal your body's true age. We've also developed a digital platform that provides personalized insights and recommendations as to how to lower your biological age based on your specific DNA methylation. And we have a supplement line of interesting and unique molecules targeted to address the established hallmarks of aging. Our co-founders are Dr. David Sinclair, who is a renowned longevity and aging expert who runs a lab out of Harvard, and Whitney Casey, who's a serial entrepreneur and venture partner at 𝐿-Caterton, who actually incubated Tally Health and funded it in the beginning, which was just a little over a year ago. So I met David and Whitney and was just astounded by the level of innovation and research going on in longevity and aging science. Quickly read David's book and listened to his podcast and felt like there was such a wealth of information of real science, and that needed to be brought to many more people who may not be scientists or may not have access to some of this information. So really creating a consumer platform around that and elevating awareness and education around what's going on in the labs was really the spark. And for me personally, Tally represents a combination of a number of long-held passions of mine: consumer-focused healthcare, using technology, data, and science to improve people's lives, and also, the opportunity to build and scale a company that can really improve millions of people's lives and how they age. So that's my story.
Great. How about you, Celine?
Yeah, my name's Celine Halioua. I am the founder and CEO of a company called Loyal. We're developing FDA-approved drugs to extend dog lifespan and health span. And as you can probably guess, there's a dog-to-human strategy here. So the dog is one of the best models of human aging. Dogs age like us, who've co-evolved with us. Something that works in a dog is not one-to-one to work in a human, so please don't buy our dog drugs when they're on the market to give to yourself, in addition to that being illegal. But it tells us a lot more about how a complex organism ages and what may or may not impact the rate of aging and extend a healthy lifespan. I have a neuro background, did a PhD, or started a PhD at Oxford in health economics, and then I worked with Laura Deming at the Longevity Fund, where we were funding companies investing and starting and working on longevity drugs. And I got pretty frustrated because every company that pitched us, at least at that time, had a very similar pitch, like, oh, we have this drug, it extends lifespan and health span in mice. But, slide 3, FDA's evil, aging isn't a disease, so we're gonna develop this, longevity drug for some ocular disorder or a neurodegenerative disorder, something that that isn't aging, right? But is thought as a proxy for aging. And I just didn't understand why nobody in the field, and as far as I know, is this still true today, is going to get a drug approved and is working on trying to get a drug approved where the thing on the label is lifespan and health span extension. Not a disease, not anything else. It's just you would buy this drug to extend healthy lifespan, and it's approved by the FDA, one of the highest objective scientific quality bars in the world. So I started Loyal at the end of 2019 with that goal in mind. It was just me and a really shitty pitch deck. Really shitty. Since then, we've raised about $58 million to date from some of the best investors in Silicon Valley. But much more importantly, we've done a lot of very, very good science and one recent milestone we had is we received the first ever FDA blessing for a clinical trial, a pivotal clinical trial to measure lifespan and health span. So again, not a specific disease. Yeah, it's been a blast.
Wow, that's very fast. From 2019 to here.
Yeah.
That's quite a rapid trajectory. So before we kind of dig into some more details, wanted to have this kind of conversation around longevity. At our fund, one of the things we talk about is if the oldest living human on the earth that we're aware of is 120, that makes 60 the new halfway point. And think about all the different ways as an individual you'd think about life if you knew you're going to live to be 120, the decisions you'd make, the choices you'd make, how you'd live your life, and then the implications as a society of all the infrastructure needed to support a much larger cohort of people living into their hundreds. And so in some ways, how we define longevity matters. And whenever I mention this 120 number, let me raise a hand. How many of you would like to live to be 120? So there's this divide, right? Some people say, absolutely, I'd love that. And the other half are saying, I only want to live that way if I have financial longevity, if I have health span longevity. And so I was curious from your perspectives, whether you think how you define longevity, and whether you think, not as a good or a bad, but just kind of why this topic of longevity is important.
Yeah, I mean, longevity is certainly the purest definition of duration of life, but I think what we really should be talking about is not just lifespan, but health span, which Celine also mentioned, right? And that's the what if, right? Or that's only if. That's that part of the phrase there of like, hey, it's not just about adding additional years to your life. It's like, how do we be our best selves for as long as possible? And at Tally, we're very focused on health span. So if you're gonna live to 80, 90, over 100, hopefully, that would be great. But how do we make as many of those years as productive and happy and healthy as possible? So I think looking at health span and that sort of definition of how long can you live healthy and free of disease and conditions is really important.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to be a little bit antagonistic. People always quote this 120-year lifespan number, that the first person to live, on average 120 is born today. It's all bullshit. Like, it's complete and total bullshit. And anybody who is saying that they have some intervention or some way that's going to extend your lifespan to 120 is just trying to sell you something. That's not how drugs work. It's not how biology works. It's all incremental progress. And aging in itself is one of the most complex biological phenomena there is, because it includes your genetic predisposition, it includes your environment, it includes biological randomness. If you're hit by some UV ray that does a certain mutation that causes something 20 years later, and to develop any intervention that effectively measures that effectively affects that is incredibly, incredibly difficult. So I think the way we think about aging drugs, and I think the way that the field is moving towards thinking about aging drugs, is not, huge lifespan extension or whatever. It's about preventative medicine to reduce the risk of future age-related diseases. And we already have this. Statins are one of the most successful drug categories, the most successful drug category in the world. The category as a whole made about $1 trillion of revenue. The best-selling drug in the world is Lipitor, which is a statin. And what a statin fundamentally is a cheap daily prescription medicine to reduce your risk of a future age-related disease, in that case, cardiac disease. So that's really how I think about the field. And if we can, it also makes it less distracting, because when you talk about longevity or huge extended lifespan, then you get into all this socioeconomic and social and political questions. They're just not relevant, when realistically what we're just trying to do is just reduce the onset and severity of diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancer, that are incredibly difficult to treat once you develop them.
And actually, our lifespan in the United States went down over the past 2 years, didn't go up as well. And so,
well, that's just COVID, right?
It's not just COVID, no. But what I'm saying is, when you talk about incrementalism, this thought of, I'm agreeing with you to this extent of, this isn't going to be everybody's living to 120, it's a complete outlier, but it does, in our experience, emphasize the point that as we have an aging population, we don't have some of those socioeconomic support systems that we, as much as we need, just from a pure, from our ability to digest
well, in many
more
ways,
people aging.
I would actually suggest that a population that's on an effective aging drug will require less socioeconomic support, because the things that like drives, like for example, I've had medical bills when I was in my 20s that, fucked up my credit score, freaked up my credit score for, 10 years. If you aren't developing a disease or you develop it later, you have more economic mobility, for example. So I think it's like figuring out the perspective and how to think about that is, I don't think it's inherently bad for society if we have a healthier population that lives longer. I think it'll actually be a lot more positive.
Yeah, and it's definitely also raises questions around workforce longevity. The retirement age went down, not up during COVID, and so, or as a result of COVID. And so, how do you think about workforce longevity if you felt more confident that there's a chance that you're going to live to be in your 90s or 100s? So, switching gears to talk about the scientific development. Over the past several years, there have been so many advances in what we know about the human body, and it feels like the pace of innovation keeps increasing. And I was curious in both of your perspectives, how are you seeing what we're learning impacting the businesses that you both run? And what are you most excited about from the kind of, breakthrough is the wrong word, but in terms of science continuing to inform your business?
You want me to start? So, I think, sorry, I'm not trying to be the antagonistic third, but I think one of the things that people, the paradox about the longevity field is there's decades of research that's out there that has shown interventions extending lifespan and health span and certain mechanisms extending lifespan and health span robustly. For example, caloric restriction is the OG lifespan extension mechanism. Metabolic fitness improvement is the OG lifespan extension mechanism. So I don't think, obviously there will be many generations of aging drugs if and when this becomes a true category, but I don't think it's about, there's been some scientific discovery that's catalyzed the entire field. In fact, the things that are translating first are things that we've understand about the biology of how we pathologically age for a very long time. And really the challenge is figuring out how do we translate that? Mm-hmm. How do you, clinically measure health span? How do you clinically measure lifespan in a human that lives, 80, 90, however many years? How do you determine what's causative and not just correlative? How do you work through with the FDA within the regulatory frameworks? Those have really been, I think, the catalysts. And the other catalyst, I think, has been the financial interest in the field. It's super friggin' expensive to build drugs. We burn a lot of money per month. Of the 58 million we've raised, we're only burning it. It's just gonna go into a hole, and maybe one day money will come up the other side, and cute dogs and stuff. So it's really more, I think, on the logistical side than it is any biological catalyst.
I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. I think, there's been some really interesting scientific innovations, and I do think there have been some interesting breakthroughs. Life Biosciences recently showed that they can restore vision in primates with some cellular reprogramming. And then also Dr. Sinclair, who I work with, he and his team just recently published a paper showing that the loss of epigenetic information leads to cellular dysfunction, and that actually restoring this information can reset the epigenome, and the mice used in that research became more youthful. So again, I think that to Celine's point, it is very different than humans. However, I do think it's a big step forward in terms of the science, the research that's being done. It is a step towards where we want to go. And I think that there is tremendous progress there and hope. I'm also excited just about through the pandemic, there was a birth of many different companies in this space targeting, longevity and aging, but with real science and real data. And that's great, because what that can do is catalyze consumers to actually be empowered with information that then they can go and take the right steps to just improve their overall wellness, right? From this preventative, holistic, functional medicine perspective. And that all leads to health span and hopefully extending lifespan as well. So I do think that there have been some really interesting things going on, and it's about, okay, how do we take those learnings and package them up and share them with people who may not necessarily be scientists or have longevity as their background, but that this is real. This is actually happening now. This is not a science fiction movie, right? There's a lot of real takeaways and insights that I think people can start to incorporate these things into their day-to-day lives.
I mean, to that end, we did a search in 2022, search terms for longevity are up 3 times where they were 2021. And there are now dedicated funds, like where you used to be with Laura, like there are dedicated funds investing in longevity, both the clinical science side of it, as well as the kind of services and tech-enabled services side of it. So what don't we know yet? I mean, are there areas of research you think that should be unlocked or invested in?
I mean, we don't know it works. Nobody's proven that a drug can extend lifespan and health span. Again, there's a lot of really interesting early research out there and clinical research out there, but nobody actually knows what works. And I think more broadly, to bring it back to, again, what you're working on, like nobody really knows what's a driver and a predictor of aging, which is super important, right? Because if I gave an aging drug to you today, how do I know, A, what diseases you would have developed if you hadn't been on it? How do I know how long you would or would not have lived? How do I know, if I've impacted your mortality risk or not? That's so super key. You have to have validated ways to objectively tell if a drug is doing what you think it's doing or not, if you want to get the drug on market, if you want to sell it, if you want to make a claim and catalyze a whole industry. So some of the good work that Tally is doing and others is really critical for that, because we just don't have a way to know yet if an aging drug's working. It's one of the reasons I'm doing it in dogs, because dogs live a shorter life and you can know, but you can't in people today.
Yeah, there's an incredibly, well, this is going to sound very morbid, but there's not a lot of mortality data out there that, because people don't do these studies, where they do them, they have to literally run them until you have that data. And so I think you're right. I mean, that is missing, but we have to start somewhere. And so, what we're doing at Tally, it's a membership model where you take an epigenetic age test, you follow the recommendations.
For the audience, what is an epigenetic age test?
So it's basically, our test is based on DNA methylation, which is basically looking at thousands of sites along your DNA where there's a methyl group attached. These, basically, it's how your genes express themselves. It's not your genetics, which don't change. This is more of a landscape of how they express themselves, and that does change over time. That does change with aging, and it does correlate with various lifestyle choices and your environment. And so we're looking at that. And what we're basically saying is, based on this landscape, your body looks like a typical 35-year-old, but you may chronologically be 30 or 40, either way, right? And then we are, again, analyzing that data and providing recommendations as to how to improve. And those recommendations are based on research that, certain things you can adjust in your life are correlated to overall better health. So we're not saying it's going to extend your life by 5 years, but we will say, hey, this is actually going to improve your overall health and wellness. And then we have the supplements, of course. But what I'm excited about is that we retest our members on a regular basis. And so what we're building is not just a large consumer DNA methylation database, which is great that we have, but we're building a longitudinal database where we can really, to Celine's point, start to really look at not just correlations, causations. We'd love to integrate additional health data to, again, refine that. And it's a place to start, right? I think it's, we're trying to build that data so that we have a stronger foundation to stand on.
So, we have this conversation a fair amount around kind of behavior versus, more of the clinical the pharmacology. As you look at, and I'm going to be interested from the sense of the dog, of working with canines, it's in some ways with humans, it's saying, well, if you sleep well and you eat well and you exercise a lot and you have low stress and all of these things, those are all behavioral influencers in Healthspan. How do you think about that in your research, kind of the behavior versus the biology?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why studying aging is so hard, because it's inherently dependent on time, and time introduces variability, right? It's also dependent on preventative medicine, or what kind of dog food you feed, or what you eat, or how much you exercise, or whatever. And so that means if you want to show that something impacts a population regardless, you have to control for all of those factors and ensure that it's basically, let's say, this isn't true. Let's say living in San Francisco extends your lifespan by like an average of 2 years, which it probably does the opposite. you need to make sure that you control for that in your study so that even if there's some variance in those who are treated, so the control group who aren't getting an aging drug or living 2 years longer, that can mess up your data. You need to make sure you control for that within your study, that your study is powered, that you have enough animals or humans in your study, so whatever variability, a dog getting hit by a car, whatever it is, doesn't destroy the rigor of the science that you're doing. In dogs, that means thousands. In humans, again, the best comparator is heart medicines, and those studies will be tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people in their late stage studies. So it's really just you have to control or you have to account and insulate your study for this variability. And the other reason it's important is because of a safety thing. The COVID vaccine is a great example of basically how safe any aging intervention would need to be. Safe as water. Basically, a large portion of the population who's currently healthy has to be able to take the intervention and not die tomorrow to prevent something they may or may not have developed 40 years from now. And the only way you can see if there's long tail negative impacts of a certain intervention, again, is running a study where you have a huge amount of participants on or not on the drug to see if it impacts them. And I think that's why it's very important to do education about this kind of stuff, because that's why a lot of small N studies aren't that exciting, because you don't catch the tail order effects, and tail order effects are everything in aging.
Yeah. And obviously the Tally business is built upon David Sinclair's research. And for those of you who have read his book, he has many recommendations, many of which are behavioral.
Yeah.
And so how do you think about that mix between behavior and then introducing new biologics into the system?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two paths. We did not go the FDA route, and we're not creating drugs, but we are creating this other type of platform. And so I think the two paths can actually be in harmony with one another, right? And they should be. So I actually think it's terrific. For us, there was a recent study published in a journal that was really eye-opening for us. It's less than 10% of your longevity is based on your genetics. Mm-hmm. And the other 90% is based on your lifestyle choices and your environment, which you may or may not be able to change. But it is, not necessarily all about your genes. And so that is, for us, it was, not only eye-opening, it kind of debunks a myth that people think about, I can't change it. This is how I was born. This is what's going to happen to me. So I think it's just, for me, it's a much more general mindset shift that hey, there are actually things that you can do to help. And that is a lot about the behaviors that what you eat, how stressed out you are, the items that you mentioned, and the things that David writes about in his research. So, I think that, I think they go hand in hand, really.
Absolutely. So aging is a global issue. In fact, Japan is ahead of us in terms of 30% of their population will soon be over the age of 65. We're heading towards 25% of the American population. And I'm curious, in the clinical world, where is the US leading in the research? Are you finding that you have kind of compatriots evenly distributed globally? Where is that sit in terms of the kind of global research agenda?
What do you mean by leading? Investment in it, or drug development, or?
That's a good qualifier. More just in the number of companies working on the innovation in the space.
Yeah, the US leads in drug development across the world. EU is obviously a huge one too, but for context, there's harmonization councils. So for many major countries, if a drug is FDA approved, it receives reciprocal approval in another country, or there's similar regulatory requirements. So you can, if you get FDA approval, then you're relatively likely to get UK approval or Japanese approval. But in general, a lot of the work comes out of the US. I think partially it's a population thing. We're just way larger than most of these countries.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of money here. This is, kind of one of the fundraising hubs of the world. And the more kind of cynical view on why is that there's a lot more money to be made in selling human drugs in the US because of the insurance system and the payer system.
Yeah.
So if you go to UK, there's a whole NICE, the whole government agency, that their job is to be your drug is only worth X amount of dollars because it gives this amount of quality of life benefit. So this is how much you can sell it for, and this is how much we'll pay, and we're not paying $1 more. EU does a somewhat similar thing. In the US, that's clearly not the case at all. So when people develop these like maximally expensive therapeutics, it's more of like an insurance and sometimes like a Medicare negotiation, but there's not it's basically easier to charge more money over here.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned before that you're going through the FDA process, is that right? And so it's kind of clear the institutions, not clear, but you've got FDA and you've got the US healthcare system to kind of as the stakeholders that ultimately you need to be working with over the long term. In your business, which is right now a consumer pay, what are the organizations and partners that you really hope to bring in to accelerate the growth of the business?
Yeah, so for us, we're direct to consumer. I think that was the original vision of how do we just move faster, quite frankly, and bring some of this to people more quickly. Over time, though, as we grow the business, I think that there is going to be an incredible opportunity for us to work with B2B players, whether that be longevity or wellness-focused clinics. I also think working with corporate wellness programs is going to be very interesting, particularly as we develop that longitudinal data and can actually show compliance to some of the recommendations that we're making, and that hopefully people who are following those are having their biological ages come down. And so going to big companies and saying, hey, look, you offer headspace as a benefit to your employees. Like, what about this, right? And then ultimately, too, to the payer, there's a huge payer opportunity as well. Again, if the data is there, to be able to go to health insurance or life insurance companies and say, look, we actually can show that these things work, but even more importantly, instead of having your black box, how about you take this epigenetic age test, which is, we think, a better indicator of someone's overall health and wellness than just how many birthdays they've had. So I think that could be very interesting.
Yep. So in the last few minutes we have together, we were commenting earlier, certainly in my line of work, running a venture fund focused on aging, I get asked all the time, Abby, what's the secret? What's the unlock? What do we need to do to live longer? And people are often dismayed by my answers. I usually have two standard answers. One is max out your 401k. It's the only free money that you ever get in terms of growing tax-free and the corporate match, and financial longevity is so important. And then the second is work longer. Which is partially related to work longevity, but also related to health span, because there is plenty of data that shows the longer you work, the happier, more fulfilled, et cetera, you are. So I am not one to positively share that there is some secret bullet, and there is no secret bullet out there. Celine mentioned as she should as a scientist, she never gives advice on how to live longer, but your business really does have some concrete recommendations, and would love to close with that.
Yeah, it's funny because the things that the doctors tell you all along are mostly true. So, and Abby mentioned a few of them, obviously don't stress out, eat well, et cetera. But I think, first of all, there's a lot that you can actually do. I think one thing is have a baseline, right? You can't change something or improve it unless you measure it first. So whether that's Tally or another wearable device or whatever, get out there and just have a baseline of where you are. I think having that information can allow you to have a more robust conversation with whoever you're working with from a care perspective. And then simple advice, I like to think in threes. So one is sleep. I don't know, this room doesn't probably get a lot of sleep, but sleep is really important. So high quality sleep. So 7 to 9 hours, believe it or not, a night. Stress, surprise, surprise, but stress is a really big driver of aging. And so if you can meditate 10 minutes a day, first thing in the morning or before you go to bed, that's super helpful. And then lastly, social. There's a 80+ year study from Harvard where they showed that the most critical factor for long-term health and happiness is your social relationships. So having strong relationships with your community, your friends, your family, or whoever actually is really important. And you see that in blue zones, which are a handful of regions around the world that have particularly long-lived communities. And what they have in common, besides a lot of things like what they eat and their active lifestyle, they have a very strong sense of community, tight-knit families, a sense of purpose. To your point, Abby, right? Working longer is, in many ways, a sense of purpose, and that really helps. So just some practical tips.
Well, I'm very excited for both of you entrepreneurs to continue to succeed in what you're doing, and we look forward to hearing about your successful FDA approval and
Hopeful,
Tally's
not guaranteed.
Exactly. We'll knock on wood. And thank you both for joining today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.